power, privilege, and danger. For centuries, the Habsburgs ruled vast empires, their lives interwoven with the destiny of Europe. But beneath the glittering crowns and grand palaces, a shadow often lurked, eager to strike. These are the stories of when that shadow emerged, aiming its deadly blow at the very heart of the dynasty. 5 moments when the world held its breath, and a monarch stood on the brink of oblivion. Number 5. A bullet in Sarajevo's sunlight? The morning of June 28, 1914, dawned clear and warm over Sarajevo, a city nestled in the heart of the Balkan Mountains. The air hummed with an unusual mix of anticipation and tension. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his beloved wife Sophie were visiting the provincial capital, a journey meant to symbolize stability and goodwill in a region simmering with unrest. For weeks, newspapers had buzzed with details of the royal couple's itinerary. They would attend a military review, then ride in a procession through the city's bustling streets, culminating in a visit to the city hall. It was to be a day of pomp and circumstance, a display of imperial might, and for many a welcome distraction. Franz Ferdinand, a man of 51, was a complex figure. He was known for his blunt manner, his fiery temper, and his deep devotion to his family. He held strong opinions on military and naval affairs, and he was a passionate hunter with thousands of trophies adorning his many estates. But perhaps his most defining trait, one that caused him endless friction with the rigid Habsburg court, was his marriage to Sophie Chotek. She was a countess, but not of royal blood, and their union was deemed morganatic, meaning their children could not inherit the throne. This slight weighed heavily on Franz Ferdinand, and he often felt isolated and undervalued within the imperial family, despite his position as heir. He was a reformer at heart, envisioning a federalized empire that would grant more autonomy to its various ethnic groups, a vision that many conservatives in Vienna viewed with suspicion. For this trip to Sarajevo, a rare concession had been made. Sophie was permitted to ride by his side in the motorcade, a small victory for their love, but one that unwittingly placed her in the line of fire. Unbeknownst to the Archduke and his entourage, a different kind of plot had been brewing in the city's shadows. A group of young Bosnian Serbs, inflamed by fervent nationalism and a desire to free Bosnia from Austro-Hungarian rule, saw the Archduke's visit as a golden opportunity. They were part of a secret society known as the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist organization with strong ties to military intelligence. Their leader, Dragutin Dimitrovic, known as Apis, was a fanatical proponent of a greater Serbia. The young men chosen for the mission were mostly students, their minds filled with revolutionary ideals and a willingness to sacrifice themselves for their cause. Among them were Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old consumed by a potent mix of tuberculosis and revolutionary zeal, Nedeljko Kabrinovic, Trifko Grebes, and others. They had received rudimentary training, some old revolvers and a few crude bombs, along with cyanide capsules, meant for suicide after the act, ensuring their silence. They infiltrated Sarajevo from Serbia, blending into the crowd, their hearts pounding with a terrifying resolve. The morning procession began like any other. 6 automobiles gleaming in the sunlight made their way along the Apocai, a wide road running alongside the Milchaka River. The first car carried local officials, then the second held the Sarajevo mayor and police chief. The third car, a black open-topped limousine, carried Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. The Archduke sat on the right, Sophie on his left, both waving politely to the curious onlookers lining the streets. They were accompanied by General Oskar Potiorik, the provincial governor, and Lieutenant Colonel Franz von Harrach. Security was surprisingly light, a grave misjudgment by the local authorities who believed the Archduke's presence would be met with loyalty, not hostility. As the motorcade passed the central police station near the Kumaraja Bridge, the first conspirator, Nedeljko Kabrinovic, stepped forward. His heart hammered in his chest. He pulled out one of the crude bombs, fumbling slightly with the detonator. He threw it with all his might towards the Archduke's car. The bomb bounced off the folded canvas roof of the vehicle and landed in the street. Behind it, there was a deafening explosion. Smoke and debris erupted into the air. The car behind the Archduke's was shattered, its occupants injured. Franz Ferdinand himself was unharmed, protected by the sturdy frame of his vehicle, though a small piece of shrapnel grazed Sophie's cheek. The Archduke, ever the soldier, remained remarkably composed. He ordered the procession to continue, only briefly checking on the injured, Tavernovic. Seeing his attempt fail, swallowed his cyanide capsule and jumped into the Miljacka River, but the poison was old and merely caused vomiting. He was quickly pulled from the shallow water by police and an angry crowd, then taken into custody. The motorcade sped up the planned route, thrown into disarray. The remaining conspirators scattered along the route were confused. Some believed the mission had been a success. Others panicked. Gavrilo Princip, standing further down the Applequay, near the Latin Bridge, heard the distant explosion, but saw the Archduke's car rush past him, seemingly unharmed. He was filled with despair, believing his chance was lost. The procession continued towards the city hall, where the Archduke and Sophie were greeted by a shaken mayor. Franz Ferdinand, still rattled, but defiant, interrupted the mayor's welcoming speech with a furious retort. About the bomb. Mr. Mayor, I came here on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs. It is outrageous. Sophie quickly calmed him, and he apologized for his outburst. After the strained welcome at the city hall, the Archduke and his retinue decided to alter their plans. Instead of proceeding with the planned itinerary, which included a visit to a museum, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the hospital to check on the officers wounded by the bomb. This change of plans, however, was not properly communicated to the drivers. The new route would take them back along the Applequay, but instead of continuing past the Latin Bridge, they were meant to turn right into Franz Joseph Street. As the led car, followed by the Archduke's limousine, approached the Latin Bridge, the driver of Franz Ferdinand's car, Leopold Lochka, unfamiliar with the revised route, made a crucial error. He continued straight, following the original plan, and drove past the street where they were supposed to turn. General Potiorek, realizing the mistake, shouted at the driver to stop and back up. The car slowly ground to a halt right in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, and there, by an astonishing stroke of fate, stood Gavrilo Princip. He had just emerged from the Delicatessen, having bought a sandwich, still reeling from the failure of the first bomb. He looked up, and to his disbelief, saw the Archduke's open-topped car stationary just a few feet away. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie sat there exposed, looking directly at him. It was a chance beyond his wildest dreams, a second opportunity delivered by an unforeseen twist of destiny. Princip, his heart racing, instinctively seized the moment. He pulled out his FN Browning Model 1910 pistol, a small semi-automatic weapon. He stepped forward, raising the pistol. The crowd, bewildered by the stalled car, was momentarily silent. He fired 2 shots from point-blank range, aiming for the Archduke. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen, severing an artery. She collapsed onto Franz Ferdinand's lap. The second bullet, intended for the Archduke, struck him in the neck, severing his jugular vein. Chaos erupted. The crowd screamed. Lieutenant Colonel Harek, who had taken position on the left running board to protect the Archduke after the first attack, realized too late what was happening. He lunged at Princip, but the shots had already been fired. Princip attempted to turn the gun on himself, but someone from the crowd or security grabbed his arm, preventing him. He then tried to swallow his cyanide capsule, but he was quickly overwhelmed. Bystanders and police officers wrestled him to the ground, beating him savagely before dragging him away inside the car. The scene was horrific. Sophie, mortally wounded, gasped, "For God's sake! What has happened to you?" Franz Ferdinand, his voice weak, pleaded, "Suffer. Suffer. Don't die. Stay alive for our children." He then slumped forward, his head resting against Sophie's shoulder, blood gushing from his neck. General Potiorek and Herak desperately tried to help, undoing his collar, but it was clear the wounds were fatal. The driver, ordered to speed away, drove frantically towards the Konak, the governor's residence. Upon arrival at the Konak, both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were carried inside. Doctors were quickly summoned, but it was too late. Sophie died within minutes. Franz Ferdinand lingered for a short time. His last words, a repeated quiet prayer. He died at 11 a.m., just an hour after the first bomb attempt. Their bodies, now silent and still, lay side by side, their lives extinguished in a flash of violence on a sunlit Balkan street. The news spread like wildfire, first to Sarajevo, then across the empire and the world. Shock, disbelief, and outrage rippled through Vienna. Emperor Franz Joseph, now 83, received the news with characteristic stoicism, but the blow was profound. "Horrible," he reportedly muttered. "The Almighty does not allow himself to be challenged. A higher power has restored the order I unfortunately was unable to maintain." He saw it as divine retribution for his nephew's morganatic marriage, a sign of God's displeasure. Gavrilo Princip, along with his surviving co-conspirators, was arrested and interrogated. Under torture, they confessed their involvement and implicated the Black Hand. Principet, being underage at the time of the assassination, escaped the death penalty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would die of tuberculosis in Terezin Fortress in April 1918, just months before the end of the war. His actions had ignited. Nedeljo Kabrinovic also died of tuberculosis. The other conspirators received long sentences or were executed. The assassination plunged Europe into a diplomatic crisis. Austria-Hungary, blaming Serbia for orchestrating the plot, issued a harsh ultimatum. When Serbia failed to accept all its terms, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914. This declaration triggered a cascade of alliances and counter-alliances drawing in Russia, Germany, France, and Britain. Within weeks, the continent was engulfed in a conflagration that would become known as the Great War, a conflict that ultimately claimed millions of lives and reshaped the Gilladine landscape of the world. The ancient Habsburg Empire, though it would fight valiantly for 4 more years, would not survive the cataclysm, its destiny irrevocably tied to the fate of its murdered heir. Number 4. A Blade on the Bastion. It was a cold, blustery winter day in Vienna, February 18, 1853. Snow lay thick upon the ground, a pristine blanket muffling the sounds of the bustling imperial capital. Emperor Franz Joseph I, then a young man of 22, still relatively new to the throne he had inherited, amidst the revolutionary tumult of 1848, was out for one of his regular walks. He was known for his dedication to duty and his somewhat Spartan lifestyle, often eschewing the opulence of the Hofburg Palace for simpler routines. He preferred to walk often alone or with a single aide along the city's ancient ramparts, the formidable walls that had protected Vienna for centuries. These daily strolls were a moment of quiet reflection for the young monarch, a brief respite from the demanding affairs of state. On this particular afternoon, the emperor walked along the Karnarter Bastion, a high defensive wall offering panoramic views of the city. He was accompanied by Count Maximilian O'Donnell von Tyrconnell, his aide-de-camp, a trusted military officer. Franz Joseph, tall and slender, wore a simple military greatcoat. He was a striking figure, with his neatly trimmed side whiskers and piercing blue eyes, an embodiment of the youthful energy he brought to the ancient dynasty. He was focused on his thoughts, perhaps contemplating the complex political landscape of his vast empire, which stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, encompassing a multitude of languages and cultures. Unbeknownst to the emperor and his aide, a troubled man had been nursing a dark obsession. János Libini, a 21-year-old Hungarian tailor, harbored deep resentments against the Habsburg monarchy. Hungary had been a hotbed of nationalist fervor. In 1848, rising in rebellion against Austrian rule, a revolt that had been brutally suppressed. Libeni, like many of his countrymen, felt the sting of defeat and the oppressive weight of imperial control. He believed the emperor was a tyrant personally responsible for the suffering of his people. He had come to Vienna with a singular desperate goal, to avenge Hungary and strike a blow against the symbol of its oppression. He had no grand organization behind him, No network of conspirators, only a burning individual rage that had festered within him. He was a solitary figure, driven by fanaticism. Lebenny had been observing the emperor's routine for several days, noting his predictable walks along the bastion. He carried a large, sharp kitchen knife, his chosen instrument of vengeance. The snow-covered streets and the cold wind provided a cloak of anonymity. He waited, his heart pounding, as Franz Joseph and O'Donnell approached his chosen spot on the bastion. The moment was almost upon him. As Franz Joseph walked along the parapet gazing out over the city, Lebenny seized his chance. He emerged from behind a snow-covered bench, moving with sudden, desperate speed. He lunged at the emperor from behind, aiming the knife directly at his neck. The attack was swift and unexpected, a blur of movement in the crisp winter air. The sharp blade struck Franz Joseph, but instead of piercing his neck, it was deflected. The sturdy high collar of the emperor's military greatcoat, reinforced with stiff material and thick embroidery, took the brunt of the blow, preventing the knife from penetrating deeply. The blade glanced off the collar, leaving a deep gash, but inflicting only a superficial wound on Franz Joseph's skin near his ear. Franz Joseph stumbled forward, momentarily stunned, instinctively clutching his neck. Count O'Donnell, who had been walking a step or two behind the emperor, reacted with astonishing speed. He immediately recognized the danger and sprang into action. Without hesitation, he tackled Lebenny, wrestling him to the ground. The assailant struggled fiercely, still brandishing the knife, but O'Donnell, a trained military man, overpowered him. At that very moment, a passing civilian, a butcher named Joseph Ettenreich, witnessed the attack. He rushed to O'Donnell's aid, helping to subdue the struggling tailor. Together, they disarmed Lebenny and held him down until police officers, alerted by the commotion, arrived on the scene. The entire incident had unfolded in a matter of seconds, a terrifying sudden eruption of violence that shattered the quiet afternoon. Franz Joseph, though shaken and bleeding slightly from the superficial wound, remained remarkably composed. He clutched his neck, his hands stained with a small amount of blood. The initial shock quickly gave way to a sense of relief and quiet defiance. He was alive. The attack had failed. Lebenny was immediately arrested and taken into custody. His interrogation revealed his nationalist motives and his solitary, fanatical nature. He openly admitted his intent to kill the emperor, driven by his burning hatred for the Habsburgs and their suppression of Hungarian liberty. The news of the assassination attempt sent shockwaves through Vienna and across the empire. The public was outraged and rallied around their young emperor, expressing profound relief at his escape. Franz Joseph's wound was minor, requiring only a simple dressing, but the psychological impact was deeper. He had stared death in the face. The resilience he showed in the immediate aftermath only cemented his image as a stoic and dedicated ruler. Count O'Donnell was hailed as a national hero and rewarded handsomely for his quick thinking and bravery. He was elevated to the status of a Count of the Austrian Empire and received the Commander's Cross of the Imperial Order of Leopold. Joseph Ettenreich, the civilian who assisted, was also knighted. Janos Lebenny's trial was swift. He was found guilty of attempted regicide. On February 26, 1853, just 8 days after his attack, he was executed by hanging in the public square of the Spinneren am Kreuz, on the outskirts of Vienna. His desperate act of vengeance ended not in revolution, but in a public spectacle that aimed to deter any further such attempts against the imperial family. In the wake of the assassination, a wave of religious fervor swept through Austria. Emperor Franz Joseph himself vowed to build a church as an offering of thanks for his survival. This grand undertaking led to the construction of the magnificent votive Kirche, or votive church, in Vienna. Designed in the Gothic Revival style, its twin spires would eventually pierce the Viennese skyline, a towering monument to a young emperor's miraculous escape, and a visible reminder of the day. A tailor's knife. The scar near his ear, though small, remained a permanent mark on Franz Joseph's, silent testament to the close call that shaped his early reign. And underscored the ever-present dangers faced by Europe's crowned heads. Number 3. The stiletto in Geneva. The calm waters of Lake Geneva shimmered under the late summer sun on September 10, 1898. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, a woman of 60 years famous throughout Europe for her ethereal beauty, and her restless spirit, was preparing to board the steamship Geneve. She was traveling incognito, as was her preference, using the pseudonym Countess of Hohenhems. Elizabeth, or Sisi as she was affectionately known, was not merely an empress consort to Emperor Franz Joseph. She was a legend in her own time, a poet, an equestrian, and a woman who constantly sought to escape the confines of court life. Her life was marked by both immense privilege and profound personal sorrow, including the tragic suicide of her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, 9 years earlier. That loss had deepened her already existing melancholy, and her wanderlust driving her to travel ceaselessly across Europe, seeking solace and anonymity away from Vienna. On this particular day, Elizabeth had stayed at the opulent Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva. She was accompanied only by her lady-in-waiting, Countess Sesteret. Despite her attempts at privacy, her identity was an open secret among the hotel staff and local residents. Her striking appearance, even in her later years, with her famously long dark hair and slender figure, made her instantly recognizable. She was on her way to a mountain resort for a change of air. The journey from the hotel to the Geneve pier was short. A brief walk along the promenade, but it would prove to be her last. Unbeknownst to the Empress, a 25-year-old Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini had been stalking Geneva's elegant streets for days, his mind alight with a desperate destructive purpose. Lucchini was a drifter, a former construction worker and valet who nursed a deep-seated grievance against society, particularly against the wealthy and powerful. He harbored a vague but intense desire to strike a blow against the established order, to make a name for himself through an act of supreme violence. He had initially planned to assassinate Prince Henry of Orleans, but the prince had changed his travel plans. Lucchini then read in a newspaper that Empress Elizabeth was in Geneva. He saw in her not a grieving woman, but a symbol of the aristocracy he despised, a figurehead of the system he yearned to shatter. He decided she would be his victim. Lucchini was a man of little means. He had no gun, so he improvised. He sharpened a 3-sided needle file, a tool used for metalwork, into a makeshift stiletto. He then fitted it with a wooden handle. It was a crude but lethally sharp weapon, easily concealable and designed to inflict a deep, narrow wound. He had no co-conspirators, no grand organization, only his individual rage and his sharpened tool. He staked out the Empress's hotel, observing her movements, waiting for the opportune moment. As Elizabeth and Countess Sesteret left the Hotel Beau Rivage, they walked briskly along the lakeside promenade towards the steamship landing. The sun was bright, and a gentle breeze swept off the lake. The Empress, as was her habit, carried a small silk parasol to protect her delicate complexion. She moved with an almost ethereal grace, her face partially obscured by a veil, but her presence was unmistakable. There was no security detail, no guards, just the two women walking alone, enjoying the fresh air. As they neared the gangplank of the Geneve, Luigi Lucchini sprang from behind a chestnut tree. He moved with a sudden, desperate lunge. He charged directly at the Empress, seemingly intending to punch her in the chest. He struck her with a powerful blow. The sharpened stiletto gripped tightly in his hand, plunged into her left side just below the breast. The attack was so swift and unexpected that neither Elizabeth nor Countess Sesteret initially grasped what had happened. Lucchini immediately turned and fled into the bustling crowd, disappearing into the labyrinthine streets of the city. Elizabeth gasped. A small sound of pain cried out. Elizabeth put a hand to her chest where the blow had landed. "What did he want?" she asked, her voice calm, almost bewildered. "He hit me." She stumbled slightly, but quickly regained her composure. The blow had seemed relatively minor, a hard punch perhaps, not a deep wound. The stiletto with its narrow blade had pierced her without leaving much external bleeding. creating only a small, almost invisible puncture wound. Despite the impact, the Empress was determined not to miss her ship. She continued walking towards the gangplank, supported by her lady-in-waiting. She even managed to board the Geneve and walked across the deck to her seat, but as the ship pulled away from the pier, heading out into the lake, Elizabeth's strength began to rapidly fail. She became pale, her face contorted in agony. She started to sway, then slowly collapsed onto a bench. Countess Sestere, now deeply alarmed, frantically tried to assist her. She loosened Elizabeth's tight corsets, thinking she had simply fainted or suffered a heart attack. As her corsets were unlaced, a small dark stain began to spread across the front of her white chemise. It was blood slowly seeping from the almost imperceptible wound. Panic set in. The ship's captain, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately turned the Geneve back towards Geneva. Two gentlemen, on board one, a doctor, and the other a medical assistant, rushed to her aid. They examined her, discovering the tiny triangular puncture wound in her chest. They understood the grim truth. A stiletto had pierced her heart. The narrow wound, combined with the tight corsets, had initially prevented massive bleeding and delayed her collapse, but the internal damage was catastrophic. The ship docked again. Elizabeth was carefully carried back to the Hotel Beau Rivage. By the time she was laid upon her bed, her breathing was shallow, her pulse barely perceptible. A local priest was called. At 2:40 p.m., just over an hour after the attack, Empress Elizabeth of Austria was pronounced dead. Her heart, so long burdened by sorrow and restlessness, had finally given out. The news of her death shocked the world. Emperor Franz Joseph was devastated, reportedly saying, "She wanted to travel, and now she has, but not the way she imagined." The vibrant, enigmatic Empress, once the most beautiful woman in Europe, had met a brutal and senseless end on a quiet lakeside promenade. Luigi Lucchini, fleeing the scene, was quickly apprehended by the police. After a tram driver identified him, he boasted of his act, expressing no remorse. "I am an anarchist," he declared. "I am poor. I want the death of all those who are rich, who live on the blood of the people." He was brought to trial in Geneva. He openly admitted to the assassination, proclaiming it was a blow against the ruling class. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, as Switzerland had abolished the death penalty. Lucchini would hang himself in his cell in 1910, his life ending as violently and tragically as the one he had taken. Elizabeth's assassination sent a shiver through Europe's royal houses, highlighting the growing threat of anarchist violence that targeted heads of state across the continent. Her funeral in Vienna was a somber spectacle, with thousands mourning the lost empress. Her death served as a stark reminder that even those cloaked in the grandest imperial robes were vulnerable to the simmering resentments and fanatical ideologies that festered beneath the surface of the Belle Epoque, forever changing the narrative of the beautiful empress to one of tragic, violent martyrdom. Number 2. The Conspiracy of Noble Betrayal. The year is 1671. The Holy Roman Empire, under the long and often challenging reign of Emperor Leopold I, was a vast, sprawling entity still recovering from the devastation of the 30 Years' War. Leopold I, a man of profound religious devotion and a keen interest in art and music, was also a shrewd and determined ruler, keenly aware of the numerous threats to his authority. His court in Vienna was a center of power and culture, but beyond its walls, in the far-flung corners of his empire, discontent often simmered. One such region was Hungary, a land long integrated into the Habsburg domains, but fiercely protective of its traditional liberties and autonomy. Leopold's reign was marked by constant struggles: wars against the Ottoman Empire, conflicts with France, and internal tensions, particularly with the powerful Hungarian nobility. These magnates, as they were known, resented the erosion of their traditional rights and the heavy-handed approach of Vienna. They chafed under increased taxation, the presence of German garrisons, and what they perceived as the emperor's disregard for Hungarian law and custom. Leopold, for his part, sought to consolidate Habsburg power, to create a more unified and centralized state, a goal that often clashed directly with the aspirations of the Hungarian aristocracy. Amidst this simmering discontent, a serious conspiracy began to take shape, one that threatened the very foundations of Leopold's rule, and implicitly his life. This was the so-called Wesselenyi conspiracy, named after Ferenc Wesselenyi, the Palatine of Hungary, the highest Hungarian official. He was a powerful and respected figure, but also deeply disillusioned with Habsburg rule. Alongside him were other prominent Hungarian and Croatian nobles: Peter Zrínyi, Ban of Croatia, Ferenc Nadasdy, one of Hungary's wealthiest landowners, and István Fokolyi, a powerful baron. These men were not common assassins. They were pillars of society, driven by a desire to restore Hungary's independence and protect their ancient privileges. Their aim was not a simple murder, but a political coup, a forceful removal of Leopold I from their lands, which in the brutal realities of 17th century politics could easily lead to violence and death if the emperor resisted. The conspirators met in secret, exchanging coded letters and hushed conversations in their grand estates. They discussed various plans: an open rebellion, seeking foreign support from France, or even the Ottoman Empire, and the possibility of deposing the emperor or his representatives in Hungary. While the primary goal was political autonomy, or even outright secession, the inherent danger to the emperor's person in such a widespread and armed rebellion was undeniable. If Leopold were to resist the uprising, his life would be on the line, and the conspirators understood this. A successful rebellion would mean an end to his direct rule in Hungary, and potentially a more drastic solution if he refused to cede control. The threat of violence, of a direct confrontation that could lead to the emperor's demise, loomed over their plotting. However, the conspiracy was plagued by internal divisions and a fatal lack of secrecy. The network was too large, the ambitions too varied. Rumors began to reach Vienna. Leopold I, always cautious and attentive to intelligence, was soon made aware of the escalating unrest and the specific names involved. His agents and informers were active, carefully monitoring the activities of the disaffected nobles. The court was deeply alarmed. Such a widespread plot involving some of the most influential figures in the empire posed an existential threat. In early 1670, the Habsburg authorities moved swiftly. Ferenc Wesselenyi died of natural causes just before the full force of the crackdown, saving him from the gallows. However, the other main conspirators were not so fortunate. Peter Zrínyi, Ferenc Nadasdy, and Ferenc Frangpan, another Croatian noble, were arrested. Their trials were conducted by a special tribunal in Vienna, marked by intense scrutiny and a foregone conclusion. They were accused of high treason, of plotting to overthrow the emperor's rightful rule, and of seeking to invite foreign powers into the empire. The evidence, much of it extracted through harsh interrogation, clearly pointed to their desire to break away from Habsburg control, an act deemed unforgivable. The emperor, despite his quiet and pious nature, was resolute in demonstrating the consequences of treason. He understood that mercy in this instance could be perceived as weakness and invite further rebellion. The sentences were severe: death by execution, confiscation of their vast properties, and the eradication of their names from the annals of noble families. The executions were carried out in 1671, sending a chilling message throughout the empire. Ferenc Nadasdy was beheaded in Vienna on April 30th, a public spectacle meant to instill fear and obedience. Peter Zrínyi and Ferenc Frangpan were executed in Wiener Neustadt on April 30th as well, both meeting their end by beheading. The scale of the executions involving such high-ranking nobles was unprecedented for Leopold's reign, and deeply shocked European society. It was a brutal display of imperial power, a forceful suppression of dissent that left no doubt about the emperor's resolve to maintain his authority. Leopold I, though not directly harmed by the plot, had faced a significant and grave threat to his throne and his very life: the Wesselenyi conspiracy. While not an assassination attempt, in the sense of a single individual striking with a knife or gun, was a wide-ranging aristocratic plot whose success would inevitably have led to violent confrontation. It was an existential threat, a deliberate attempt by powerful men to forcibly remove him from power, which, in an absolute monarchy, often meant his physical elimination. The emperor had survived, but the brutal crackdown that followed had far-reaching consequences. The immediate aftermath was harsh. Leopold I, seeking to crush Hungarian separatism, once and for all imposed direct rule, abolished the office of Palatine, and implemented a policy of Germanization and Catholicization, persecuting Protestants. This heavy-handed approach, however, only fueled further resentment and eventually led to another, even larger uprising, led by Imre Thököly, who would wage a protracted war against the Habsburgs. Leopold I learned a hard lesson from the conspiracy. While his authority had been asserted, the roots of Hungarian nationalism ran deep. His survival and the suppression of the plot ensured the continuation of Habsburg rule for centuries more, but the scars of that betrayal and the emperor's brutal response would linger in the collective memory of Hauer in an age of absolute monarchs and simmering national identities. Number 1. The Blood of the King on the Bridge. The year 1308. Europe was a patchwork of nascent kingdoms and powerful feudal lords, constantly vying for supremacy. The concept of the Holy Roman Empire, a vast and often fragmented entity, was slowly taking shape, and a Habsburg dynasty was still relatively new to the imperial crown. Albert I of Germany, the second Habsburg to hold the title of King of the Romans, a precursor to Holy Roman Emperor, was a man of 49, known for his stern demeanor, his political ambition, and his relentless pursuit of family power. He had inherited the title from his father, Rudolf I, and had fought hard to consolidate his authority against various rivals, including the Pope and the powerful German princes. Albert was a ruler who believed in a strong central authority, a stance that often brought him into conflict with the fragmented nature of medieval German politics. He was particularly embroiled in a dispute with his nephew John, a young man of 19, known as John Presida. John was the son of Rudolf II, Duke of Swabia, Albert's deceased brother. John felt deeply wronged and cheated out of his rightful inheritance. His father Rudolf had died young, and his lands and titles had been absorbed by his powerful uncle, Albert. John, now a young man coming of age, passionately believed that Albert had unjustly withheld his patrimony, denying him the ducal title of Swabia and the lands that came with it. This grievance festered into a burning hatred. John felt humiliated, powerless, and profoundly betrayed by his uncle the king. He had repeatedly pleaded with Albert to restore his inheritance, only to be met with dismissive replies, and on one occasion, a mocking offer of a wreath of flowers as his crown. The public humiliation and the perceived injustice drove John to a desperate resolution. He sought not merely his lands, but vengeance, a bloody settling of scores. His anger was singular, intense, and focused entirely on Albert. John was not alone in his discontent. He found allies in 3 knights, nobles who also harbored grievances against Albert I. Rudolf von Wort, Walter von Eschenbach, and Conrad von Tegerfelden joined John in his plot. They shared his resentment towards the king's overbearing nature and his increasing centralization of power, which threatened their own feudal liberties. Their plan was simple and brutal. An ambush, a swift and decisive strike against the king that would avenge John's perceived wrongs and remove powerful authoritarian ruler. The act was meticulously planned, not as part of a larger rebellion, but as a personal assassination, a familial blood feud, played out on a royal stage. The chosen day for the assassination was May 1st, 1308. King Albert was traveling with a small entourage from Baden to his ancestral home in Switzerland, the Habsburg castle. His journey took him along the Reuss River, near the town of Brugg, in modern-day Switzerland. The landscape was rural and picturesque, with the river winding through green valleys. The king, confident in his authority and accompanied by his loyal retainers, likely felt little immediate threat. His retinue included his son Leopold and a number of nobles, including the 3 conspirator knights. As the royal party reached the narrow bridge over the Reuss River, near the village of Windesheer, the conspirators separated themselves from the main group. They allowed the king's son, Leopold, and the bulk of the entourage to cross the bridge first. This was a crucial part of their plan, ensuring that only King Albert and a handful of his closest companions were isolated, making the ambush precise and deadly. When King Albert, accompanied by only a few men, including the conspirators, was alone on the bridge, John Parasida made his move. He drew his sword. The other 3 knights immediately joined him, drawing their own weapons. The attack was sudden and brutal, allowing the king no time to react or defend himself. John, fueled by years of festering rage, struck his uncle with savage force, aiming for his head. The blows rained down. One blow struck Albert in the neck. Another cleaved through his helmet. The king, bleeding profusely, fell from his horse onto the ground. The conspirators, ensuring their work was done quickly, rode away, leaving the dying monarch behind. The scene was one of shock and horror. The few loyal attendants who remained were stunned and helpless. One account describes a young peasant woman who found the king lying in a pool of blood, his head in her lap, comforting him in his final moments. King Albert I, the ambitious and stern Habsburg monarch, died on the muddy banks of the Reuss, murdered by his own nephew in a shocking act of regicide. The swiftness and brutality of the assassination left Europe stunned. The news rippled through the Holy Roman Empire, causing widespread outrage and fear. The assassination was not merely a political act. It was a profound violation of feudal loyalty and family ties, an act that shocked the moral sensibilities of the age. John Parasida and his accomplices fled, scattering in different directions, hoping to evade capture. A massive manhunt was launched across the empire. John himself became a fugitive, hunted across Germany and Switzerland. He wandered for years, a desperate exile, eventually finding refuge in a monastery in Pisa, where he lived out his days in obscurity, tormented by his deed. He was never brought to justice, but his life was one of perpetual fear and flight. The 3 knights, his accomplices, were eventually captured. Rudolf von Vort was executed in a particularly brutal manner, in 1309, broken on the wheel, a gruesome example meant to deter anyone who dared raise a hand against a monarch. The other 2, Eschenbach and Tegerfelden, escaped and lived out their lives in hiding or exile. The assassination of Albert I plunged the Habsburg family into a period of mourning and, more importantly, a fierce pursuit of vengeance. Albert's widow, Elizabeth of Carinthia, and their sons, especially Leopold, were relentless in seeking retribution against all those even remotely connected to the crime. Castles were destroyed, lands were seized, and innocent families suffered in the widespread retaliation. The death of Albert I had significant political ramifications. It opened up a succession crisis within the Holy Roman Empire, allowing other powerful families, particularly the House of Luxembourg, to gain influence, delaying the secure establishment of Habsburg imperial power for decades. However, the assassination also cemented a sense of dynastic destiny for the Habsburgs, binding them together in a shared experience of tragedy and vengeance. The memory of the murdered king, the blood on the bridge, served as a grim reminder of the dangers of power and the lengths to which family grudges could extend, a dark stain on the nascent history of one of Europe's most enduring imperial dynasties.